Welcome to the UGC EPG Parshala lecture series in computer science. In this series of lectures, we are looking at subject software engineering. And for today's session, we will be looking at software requirements elicitation techniques. The major learning objectives for today's session would include to describe the processes of requirements elicitation, to introduce the number of requirements elicitation techniques, to discuss how prototypes may be used in the requirements elicitation process. To start with requirements elicitation, elicitation is nothing but gathering all the requirements from the stakeholders. So this encompasses a list of activities involved in discovering the requirements of a system. Thereby, the software developers and engineers who are actively involved in the development process work in close relationship with the customer and end user to find out more about the problem. So from the stakeholders perspective, the problem would have been in a different sense, whereas from the system developers and engineers perspective, the software intention of the product would have been something else. So just to think of or bridging the gap between the stakeholders and the developers, this elicitation technique helps giving in some ideas. So this helps us to find out more about the problem that is to be solved, to describe the functionalities of the system, not only on the functionalities, this also includes non-functional attributes of the system, performance of the system, hardware constraints and so forth. If you look at the requirements elicitation process, once having effectively designed or once having effectively understood on the complete of requirements, thereby we build an use case model. This is part of analysis model. Once having defined a use case model, this is very much expressed in terms of application domain. The domain in which this is to be applied can be easily understood. Once we are done with use case model, this can also help in dividing the system into subsystems. So anything that is to be drawn as a block diagram from the use case model, which is plot out of requirements elicitation process, this can easily be converted, but then this happens only after the analysis phase. For designing objects, solution provided for the domain objects can be realized after plotting the use case models, and further from the use case models it will be easy for us to develop or implement the source code by splitting each and every class. And finally, this helps us verify by defining the test cases early during the development cycle. So requirements elicitation not only helps us in identifying the use case model, but also helps in various phases starting from the analysis model till the test model. The simple use case model that we have developed clearly projects its case at each and every phase. Top 10 requirements that are trapped to avoid these requirements include: many a times the requirements posted by the stakeholders might be confusing, and there will be a lot of sequence that will be involved, or more of verbal communication would happen, which leads to unnecessary confusion. Or there can be inadequate customer involvement, vague and ambiguous requirements, unprioritized requirements. As we have mentioned in the agile process during the product backlog, as we could highlight high, medium and low prioritized product developments. Likewise, all the requirements are to be prioritized. So if there exists unprioritized activities, the developers could concentrate more on some of the unprioritized events for a longer period of time. Building functionality which no one uses can also avoid to a trap. Analysis paralysis, there can be a creep on the scope, inadequate change process, insufficient change impact analysis, inadequate version control. So these points may lead to trap if it has not been properly understood. Some of the basic elicitation activities include application domain understanding, problem understanding, business understanding, understanding the needs and constraints of the stakeholders. If you look at the diagram that I have specified here, the scope of requirements elicitation, although the requirements talk about what of the system rather than talking about why of the system, here the elicitation tries to gather all the requirements by putting a question of why, what and who type of dimensions. So the system initially to be built has some problems, opportunities and system knowledge, whereby the system that is to be developed initially to be given a list of objectives. So which mentions why this kind of a product is required in today's world. So it gives us a clear picture of the new system. And what are the services that or features that the system provides may be collected in terms of requirements, constraints and assumptions. And some of the assigned responsibilities for all these things would include the developer, the communication medium and the portability of the system. So this gives us a clear understanding of who is responsible for what type of a system. So by the application domain understanding, this gives us a knowledge of general area where the system is to be applied. So application domain gives a clear understanding on where the system has to be applied. And problem understanding gives us a clear intention of the details of the specific customer problem, where the system will be applied and must be understood. So who should understand on the problem domain, and after solving those issues, who are the end users who will apply on this problem. Basic business understanding talks more about how the systems interact and distribute to overall business goals. And finally, the understanding of the needs and constraints of the stakeholders would involve understanding in detail the specific needs of people who require the support in their work. If you look at the process of requirements elicitation, elicitation process involves 4 major challenges. It first tries to establish the objects, then tries to understand the background, then organizes all the knowledge that has been acquired so far, finally tries to collect all the requirements. So from this requirements elicitation process, we will try to establish the overall organizational objectives, why the system is necessary, and further we will try to gather and understand the background information about the system. So basically when we starting to work on a project, we may have to understand why this is essential. By plotting the objectives, we will be clear of what we are about to do and why, who are the end users who are about to use it. But then to develop on the system effectively, we may have to understand who has worked earlier on a similar type of systems, so which helps us in plotting the background study. Further, after acquiring all the background details of the similar type of projects, we will be able to get a lot of information from them, which can later on be converted and organized into a set of knowledgeable activities. So this helps us in leading to collect all the requirements in a proper manner. So this elicitation has 4 stages, as I have already told you. First is by establishing the objectives. So the major organizational objectives should be established, including general goals of the business, an outline description of the problem to be solved, why the system is necessary, and the constraints of the system need to be picturized. After acquiring these objectives, we may have to effectively plot on the background knowledge acquisition process, which is the understanding of the background. So by background information about the system includes information about the organization, where the system is to be installed, the application domain of the system, and the information about the existing systems need to be understood. So it is not just on the application domain which we are trying to implement with, or a similar type of systems that we have already developed, somebody else already developed on, and we are trying to work on advancement towards the systems. Not only on that, we will try to understand how the company or organization have been working on so far and what changes that they require through this development. After having understood on this background study, now it is a responsibility to collect all the information, convert it into a knowledge. So we may have to organize it as knowledge. So a large amount of knowledge which has been collected in the previous stage must be organized and collated, where we finalize on the goal priorities, identify who our stakeholders are, and domain knowledge filtering. Finally, or after organizing all this knowledge, now it is our responsibility to collect these knowledge into effective requirement practices. So system requirements at this stage, the system stakeholders are consulted to discover their requirements in terms of the domain, in terms of the stakeholders, and in terms of the organization. The final collected list of requirements at this stage is further given for the process of analysis. So this figure gives us a clear perspective of how requirements elicitation is being carried out over different phases. Further, as I have already mentioned, after clear understanding of the background knowledge, now it is our responsibility to convert the background study into an effective knowledge, whereby we organize, prioritize, collate the large amount of data collected in the previous phase, involve the stakeholders to discover their requirements. So once after we do on this requirements elicitation process, we convert all these requirements elicitation or requirements gathering into a analysis phase. So by analysis, we check on the necessity of why this product is required. So necessity checking being the first part of the requirements analysis, where the requirements don't contribute to the business goals. So what are the list of requirements which doesn't contribute to the goals of this particular system are initially identified, and the need for the requirements is analyzed. In some cases, requirements may be proposed which don't contribute in the business goals of the organization, or the specific problem that are to be addressed by the system are initially being identified and checked for its necessity to be included for the further development process. Further, then after having done the necessity checking, the system is checked for its consistency and completeness, where there should not be any contradictions, or there should be a flexibility checking to adjust in perspective of the budget and the schedule. So by consistency and completeness checking, we try to work on the requirements that are cross-checked for consistency and completeness. Consistency means that no requirement should be contradictory. Completeness means that no services or constraints which are needed have been missed out. So after having evaluated on the consistency and completeness, the system requires a requirements discussion which would highlight the requirements and discuss the problematic elements. And further, after completing the discussion in terms of introspection, in terms of interview and handling multiple activities, the requirements are being prioritized, where the highly complex or critical of the activity are identified for risk plot, and the lowest of the prioritized activity which can be easily implementable are also been considered. Finally, the requirements are taken for agreement which comprises between the developers and the stakeholders with a set of agreed requirements. So, this stage of requirements discussion and the prioritization is followed by a flexibility checking, where the requirements are checked that are feasible in the context of the budget and schedule available by the system development. So, once after we have clearly understood on the requirements by the use case plot, we will study on the feasibility of the system. And for requirements agreement in turn, the solution to the requirements problem are identified and a compromise on a set of requirements are agreed, and it generally involves making changes to some of the requirements. So, this is a basic process that happens during the requirements analysis phase, where between the requirements negotiation and analysis, what are the list of activities that happens. So, as I have indicated earlier, it passes through a phase of necessity check where the unnecessary requirements are taken for discussion. Then it passes through consistency and completeness check, where if there are any conflicting and incomplete requirements, those are being prioritized. And finally, for feasibility check, infeasible requirements are to be considered or not to be considered, which can be part of agreement or not been for the part of agreement, are also been discussed here. So, some of the problems that we come across during the requirements elicitation process are as follows. Stakeholders are not very clear of what they really want many a times. Although they have an intention of coming out with a product of this format, but then many a times the complete list of requirements cannot be given at a time. So, the stakeholders express their requirements on their own terms, that may also be possible. Different stakeholders, if involved, may have conflicting requirements. So, generally it cannot be assumed there will be only one stakeholder who will be presenting from the company's end. If you look at larger firms, larger organizations, where there will be one or more stakeholders who will be participating in the discussion, and they might come out with conflicting requirements. Organizational and political factors may influence this system requirements. The requirements change during the analysis process. New stakeholders may emerge and the business environment may also likely to change. As and when there is a change of the topmost authorities in the organization, the entire business environment also are likely to change. To work on this system effectively, we may have to do a lot of technique to collect all the requirements from the stakeholders. Some of the elicitation techniques include interviewing, preparing a list of questionnaire, understanding the background of the organization, introspection, social analysis, conducting requirements workshop, organizing brainstorming sessions with the facilitator, idea generation, preparing storyboard, scripted walkthrough, having CRC cards, generating ethnographs, natural language descriptions, and form analysis. So, these are majorly used requirements elicitation technique. Let us try to understand each and every elicitation technique in detail. Interviews. These interviews are generally a simple and direct technique that can be used in nearly every situation. So, you can talk to the stakeholders face to face, have a list of questionnaire, Requirements engineering analysts discuss with different types of stakeholders to understand the requirements of the system. Generally, these type of interviews either could be a closed interview or an open interview. In case of a closed interview, the requirements engineer prepares some predefined set of questions. After having verbally taken the list of requirements, he will come out with a predefined set of questions and tries to get the answers for those questions from the stakeholders. Like, say for example, if we have to develop a library management system, what a conventional library management system typically involves, with that the developer will likely to arrive at a list of questionnaire. Followed by this questionnaire, he will be presenting it to the stakeholders. And there will be open interview also, where there is no predefined questions and this person tries to get all the information from the stakeholder in open discussion. So this can several times happen, and there can be suggestions that can be put forth during this type of open discussions also. Neither of these cases, there can be close-ended questions where the stakeholders have to provide a response of yes/no format, and open-ended questions where there can be brief answers that can be given for a list of questions. After conducting these type of interviews, we may have to understand on the context of an interview. Interviews are generally been helpful when we are setting up a user profile, trying to understand on the problem, assessing the problem, understanding on the user environment. We tried to recap on the understanding that we have gathered so far. Some of the analysts' input on the user problem, many a times this kind of interview will be helpful. Assessing the solution during the interview are likely to help. There are possible probabilities of taking it forward for the opportunities and assess on the opportunities, checking forward the reliability and the support needs, concluding on it, and providing a summary will be done majorly with the context of an interview. The second nice technique that we can follow during our requirements elicitation process is preparing a questionnaire. So this questionnaire helps us identify a list of honest responses from the stakeholders. These questionnaire can either be in a manual form, that is a paper-based form, or an electronic form, which can also be in a soft copy. The effectiveness of this questionnaire is likely to be dependent on the design of the questionnaire, the template in which the questionnaire is being designed, and the response of the respondents, the stakeholders majorly. How do they respond to these set of questionnaires? Honesty is at most important. If you are likely to put forth a result on the different universities in terms of ranking, there can be a list of questionnaire which the university higher authorities will be able to respond on. So this questionnaire with a list of answers put forth by the committee will be placed, and a honest response would likely to help preparing this questionnaire or achieving at this questionnaire in an effective manner. So an effective questionnaire can be used to decide the actual user requirements, objectives, and a list of constraints. So how to prepare an questionnaire or an effective design of a questionnaire? The purpose of this survey should be clearly defined. So why we need to prepare such a questionnaire, or likelihood of such a questionnaire need to be clearly defined in the beginning. And there should be a sampling group with the respondents of the survey that should be decided early during the questionnaire preparation. And we may have to project on a clear state why the respondent was selected for the questionnaire. As I have already indicated, if suppose I am to rank on the various universities and colleges, say in India, why this college or university is being placed to answer for this questionnaire should be clearly stated. Provide clear instructions on how to complete the questionnaire. So there should be clear instructions whether to tick for the correct answers or to negate on the wrong answers are all to be clearly represented when we are designing the questionnaire. Avoid questions asking one or more. Do not ask questions that give clues to answers. Keep the questionnaire very brief and make it user friendly. Prepare and develop the questionnaire, conduct questionnaire process, gather and analyze the results. Most effectively, 30 to 50% of return rate for paper and email questionnaires happens when a questionnaire of this sort is been prepared by looking after all the design process, whereas only 5 to 30% return rate of web-based questionnaires. It is likely that in today's generation, web-based questionnaires are most being responded among the student communities. If you are likely to answer in front of the students, student responds only a web-based questionnaire, whereas higher authorities maybe within the organization they may use web-based questionnaires, but then it is majorly the students who use all the web-based resource. So this return rate is likely to have a major impact. The other technique that we may have to adopt during the requirements elicitation process is on the background reading. That is, we may have to understand the correct study of the organization, how they have been working with. So we gather the information about the organization, which is helpful to gain an understanding of the organization structure, its working and the existing system at various departments. An organization might involve various departments, likely to say with production department, warehouse department, delivery department, and so we may have to keenly understand on each and every department who are likely to work and understand on the organization structure. There are various sources of information which are likely to be present on this, like company reports, organization charts, policy manuals, documentation of existing systems. These are appropriate when the working environment is not very familiar. The other major technique that we follow during the requirements elicitation process is on the introspection, where the requirements analyst imagines what kind of system is required for doing the required job. Although we have said in the beginning, a requirements process is to basically understand what of the system rather than saying how of the system. So it is by introspection we try to imagine what the stakeholders might think in their mind, and we try to develop the similar type of a system. Requirements analyst imagines what kind of system is required for doing the required job or by using available equipment. This is majorly used when the end user is not available and they are not willing to answer the questions or shows lack of feedback. If the end user is not very much interested in answering to the major of questions and the feedback from the end users are not very happy, in those perspectives we may go for introspection, where we imagine certain things by posting questions to ourselves, or it can be even be a mirroring. If I am supposed to be the user, not as a developer, what kind of a system that I will use rather than taking the feedback from the stakeholders will be considered. In summary, what we have looked at in this particular session, we have started with saying requirements elicitation. This requirements elicitation tries to gather the requirements from the stakeholders. Then we have told about the requirements process, basic elicitation techniques and process, the various problems that these requirements elicitation would have, and finally we have started explaining about elicitation techniques like interviewing, preparing questionnaire, background understanding, and we will be continuing with the further techniques in detail. Thank you.